For every game that's shipped over the past decade, there have probably been about 10 or so canceled projects that have failed for one or multiple reasons. Sometimes the publisher just doesn't want to invest any more time or money, as was the case with the recently completed, then immediately canceled Hyenas developed by Creative Assembly. Or how about for the Super Nintendo we have Star Fox 2, which was shelved and thankfully released many years later on the SNES Classic. Some projects like the GoldenEye remaster, which was leaked a few years ago, have too many stakeholders involved and no one's able to agree on how big their slice of the pie is supposed to be, so they just scrap the entire thing like a bunch of toddlers and say, if I can't make all the money, then no one can. As tragic as it may be that some fully finished projects were never officially released, for the games that actually do ship, I estimate that about 90% of the content developed doesn't wind up shipping with the final product, though some of it may still come out post-launch in the form of DLC or perhaps even a sequel. High-profile examples here include Ocarina of Time, which was originally developed for the 64DD, but due to limitations of the medium, they opted for a traditional cartridge format. Some of the content that didn't make the cut is likely what ultimately wound up being released in the form of Majora's Mask, and if we're looking more recently, the same can be said of Breath of the Wild, which apparently had so much planned for the original game that they opted to shift a lot of features into a sequel built entirely around those concepts. Shadow of the Colossus was going to have significantly more encounters and even co-op at one point, however, unlike Zelda, they never went back to revitalizing any of these significant features in later releases. So, spending about 2 decades working as a designer wearing many different hats at a handful of studios across a wide range of projects has led me here, and I've got a lot of stories to share. Also, just to be perfectly clear, I'm still actively working in the game industry as a design lead at a high-profile studio because the combination of game development plus mentoring and or working alongside other talented designers, artists, and engineers is just something that I genuinely love to do. All that is to say, I know game development may look scary, intimidating, or even impossible right now, but while I'm on my own journey, I'd like to help by talking about some of the lessons I've learned up to this point in my career. Now let's revisit my theory that 90% of content is cut from most games developed by a big studio funded by a known publisher. For indie developers that don't necessarily have a reliable revenue stream, we simply can't waste time spinning our wheels on developing a disproportionate amount of content that may not ship with the game. Prototyping questionable features at the earliest phases of your own project will be to your benefit, so you can solidify your own timeline and scope for development. With Eevee, I actually started off with a 2D prototype that I was able to generate very quickly and validate a lot of the core gameplay I was going for. Shortly thereafter, I began exploring the concept of pivoting into an HD 2D style action-adventure game with the exact same gameplay as the prototype, but with a completely different perspective. After exploring Unity, Unreal, and some other game engines, I ultimately decided that I, very importantly, was capable of developing an HD 2D action-adventure game with specific tools and pipelines that fit both my time frame and budget. This goes back to my other devlogs where I talk about setting yourself up for success. If you lean too heavily into a feature that you don't properly research or just don't know a lot about, you could be committing yourself to something that may take significantly more time than you originally imagined. Now, my first professional gig in the industry was working full-time at a studio called NetDevil on an FPS called Warmonger Operation Downtown Destruction using Unreal Engine 3. It was designed to showcase procedural physics and destruction before the engine ever really supported anything like that. As such, being my first real job in the industry, I was working late nights and weekends and building levels for a multiplayer game that were mediocre at best, but I was single at the time and had a blast working with a small, energetic team. Later in the project's development, I wound up working on a map that was a great showcase for the destruction system, which was impressive for the time, but really shined when used with smaller features like tombstones and tile walls versus entire buildings and stairwells. The map was basically finished, but since our contract was only for 3 multiplayer levels and we never got more than a few playtests on my cemetery-inspired level, it just didn't make the cut. A few months to a year after the game had shipped, the publisher reached out and was talking about doing a re-release. So I reminded them that I had some content I'd developed late in production that was good enough to ship and leaned heavily into what the destruction system did best. They offered to pay me to polish the level I'd built, plus develop a brand new map for them, all within the span of a few weeks. My friend developed some great music for the new content, and I solicited an artist to help me quickly build some assets for the new level. So what was the takeaway here? Well, it was really cool to see my old map finally ship and even develop a brand new map with all the knowledge and experience leveraging the destruction system. The pay was nowhere near enough for the tight deadline. If people want your help, you're probably worth more than what they're asking. There are other significant lessons here, though. One is that my friend who developed the music is the only other person with me at Rebound Studios, still creating killer tracks like the one in this devlog, but also taking on narrative design and other major responsibilities for Eevee. Second, the fact that they reached out to me at all was a big deal, because they didn't have to, but they enjoyed working with a young, scrappy developer like myself so much that, with literally no oversight at all, they contracted me to develop more content for a re-release of their game. All that is to say, take note of the ones you work with best, and make sure to maintain those relationships, because nearly 20 years removed from Warmonger, my musically gifted friend and I have now collaborated across 3 separate projects, all under very different circumstances, and we've only gotten better at it each time. If you're kind and easy to work with, chances are publishers and people will remember that when they start thinking about what's next for them. After my time with Warmonger, I moved on to LEGO Universe. Again, I had a blast working with this team, though they were much larger and I didn't really play a lot of MMOs then or really ever. I did, however, play a lot of platformers, and as such, I remember working with the design leads and engineers to refine both the platforming and combat. Originally, the combat consisted of standing in place, swinging your arm around with no momentum or forward motion. It basically felt dated and lacked any real substance. So the game that I referenced the most in my conversations with the team was Ratchet & Clank, which, in addition to great platforming, had a simple yet satisfying 3-hit combo with forward momentum that would automatically track the nearest enemies. Does this look familiar? There's a lot more subtlety and nuance that goes into satisfying combat, but the point is, I evaluated where we were at the time, set a benchmark in the form of another game that I really enjoyed, and we improved the quality of our own game because of that. Now, the first, and sadly not even close to the most frustrating story that I'd like to share, came as we were in the thick of things with LEGO Universe and trying to figure out what we wanted for competitive multiplayer. At the time, I was obsessively playing Fat Princess on the PS3, so on our strike team, we decided to prototype something very similar, but with simpler objectives and, importantly, something that felt like a LEGO game. I was already a huge fan of games like Halo 2, so I built a level or two that featured one flag CTF, where one team attacks to capture the flag and bring it back to their base, while the other team defends. You can go out into the field to harvest imagination points to build defensive structures at your base, or offensive mobility mechanisms like jump pads if you're on the attacking team. This is not the first iteration, but maybe the 5th or 6th, and I'll never forget how much fun we were having trash talking and playing multiple matches in a row on the same map for way longer than we probably should have. We found the magic, or what could have been described as lightning in a bottle. So what do we do with that bottle? Well, we threw it out and built a racing engine and 3 racetracks instead, because the consensus was that kids wanted to build and race cars, not capture flags. Now, admittedly, I got to make a pretty cool racetrack out of this, but if you find something that energizes both yourself and your team that also motivates you to come back and play again, it's okay to pivot in that direction, because finding something electric and exciting in game development is worth holding on to. That's how we got games like Rocket League and Mario Kart after all. In Eevee, I originally was going to have only the protagonist roaming around the landscape, and the bat creature that represents my son when he was very sick was only going to show up during cutscenes and cinematics. My friend and colleague challenged me to actually put the bat into the gameplay in some way to make sure that they were a more impactful part of the story, and I fought against the idea initially, but he kept pushing, and I'm glad he did, because now the emotional connection you have with the creature is much stronger than it would be if they were not accompanying you for the entire journey. One more story I'd like to share today involves my time at a Houston-based studio that sadly, like NetDevil, is no longer around today. I was developing maps for the multiplayer component of a game based on a well-known IP that's had some success across multiple forms of entertainment, ranging from movies and comics to video games. At one point, I prototyped a new game mode alongside another enthusiastic systems designer that perfectly suited the brand and was very unique for competitive multiplayer at the time. It was essentially the inverse of One Flag CTF, where the attackers were tasked with delivering a bomb to the base of the enemies. The hook for this specific game mode revolved around the asymmetric multiplayer, where the attackers were in first person with guns and, as such, could only carry the bomb via a powerful, albeit slow-moving contraption that was armed to the brim with offensive capabilities. The closer the attackers got to the defender's base, the more frequently they would encounter the defenders, and the longer it would take for the attackers to reach and pilot their mobile death machine if they died, so the difficulty naturally increased as the match progressed. It played great, and a lot of people internally really enjoyed it. So what happened to the game mode? Well, we shipped basic King of the Hill instead, which contextually made far less sense than even standard team deathmatch in my opinion, but it ultimately came down to team-wide vote across all studios, and while the bomb mode actually won out, it was proposed to me that we should reduce tension between the teams and ship the mode that wasn't developed internally instead. Now, I should qualify that this game was a massive flop, primarily thanks to the campaign mode that shipped alongside it, so regardless of how great the multiplayer was, this one was destined for failure. In spite of this, however, I always wished I had held my ground and pushed harder for what was clearly better for the end product. If you have a strong understanding of your target market, and you know what will resonate with both players and fans of the game you're developing, make sure to trust your gut and lean into that. The larger the team, the louder you may have to be for an opportunity to be heard, but if it's just you and maybe one or two other people that you trust and are already aligned with, then you just need to have a solid grasp on the market you're aiming for and how to reach that audience. Basically, if you're a fan of the game you're developing, then sometimes you may need to tap into the fan side of yourself instead of the developer side to make sure you'll have the biggest impact. If you're not a fan, that's okay too, just make sure you have someone close by who is that you trust and can share their opinion. For Eevee, I love action-adventure games. I love games like Zelda, which is probably blatantly obvious if you've seen my other videos at this point, where the player is rewarded for experimentation and exploration. I also like snappy, skill-based action games like God of War and Hyper Light Drifter. When I'm making decisions about processes, pipelines, and designs, I'm leaning into the developer side of my brain. But when I'm making decisions about features and core gameplay mechanics, I try to lean more into the fan side instead. Look, I've got way more stories that I can't wait to share, but I want to wrap this up so I can offer more details in the next devlog where I can focus on some bigger franchises after my confidence had grown and I was given more responsibilities. For as long as this video has been, I didn't even cover half of my career, and the main reason I'm doing this at all is because of the comments section of my last devlog. So if there's something else you want me to dive into, please let me know and I'll be happy to talk about that next time. If Eevee is of interest to you, please feel free to hop on over to my Steam page and wishlist it. Otherwise, I hope that you found this devlog interesting, and I'm hopeful to see you again in the next one.